It was one of the largest projects in the history of mankind. The Third Reich's bomb-proof factories. Germany's Wunderwaffen were to bring death and destruction to its enemies. Gigantic underground plants would have kept the supply chain running for the Wehrmacht. Armaments Minister Albert Speer had devised a monstrous plan for his Führer. Today, only few may set foot in the remnants of the mammoth project. Hundreds of millions of Reichsmarks were spent in order to hollow out entire mountains. Production plants for weapons essential to the war effort were to be built in underground tunnel systems. Hundreds of thousands of slave laborers had to toil for the ambitious plans of the Nazis. The number of those who lost their lives is uncertain. Up until the last day of the war, work in the tunnels went on feverishly. Yet how close had the Nazis come to accomplishing their outrageous project? What would have happened if the underground armament production had run successfully? Would Hitler's war of annihilation have claimed millions more victims? A slope close to the Bavarian town of Oberammergau. Here, one of the mysterious tunnel systems laid out by the Nazis is hidden from the eyes of the inquisitive. The only entrance is blocked with a concrete seal. Only the state-appointed geologist may open it. Every few years, he has to make sure that everything inside is intact. Heinz Rabe is responsible for about 20 subterranean tunnel systems in southern and eastern Germany. He has to test whether the installations which were built 60 years ago are still safe. After the end of the war, the Americans went into the tunnels in Oberammergau and searched through everything. Since then, the tunnels have stood empty. The wooden lining is rotten, and stones may come loose from the roof at any time.
During the war, the plant belonged to Messerschmitt AG. It served as a bomb-proof production and development plant for the aircraft construction. According to the plans, there were 3 or 4 portals. We've opened one. The others were all blasted at the end of the war. Here we have 2 parallel tunnels of about 80 or 90 meters in length, connected by cross-sections. They were used as bomb-proof production plants.
The Allies knew of 340 underground construction sites even before the end of the war. Over 400 had been given code names during the Third Reich, and the plans of the Ministry of Armaments pointed to some 800 plants. The Nazi leadership had hesitated for some time before it decreed the excavation of subterranean factories. Only in the summer of 1943, when the air raids of Allied bomber squadrons became increasingly destructive, did Hitler's armament minister Albert Speer give the command to systematically transfer the war production underground. Initially, the industry rejected the idea, although the outrageous costs were borne by the government. The plans appear to be incomplete and their implementation too chaotic. At first, the Nazis had existing mines expanded. One of the first projects was realized at the end of 1943 on the bank of the Neckar River. Codename Neustadt. 120 meters deep, under the vineyard slopes, a gigantic subterranean tunnel system still lies here, out of sight. Initially, the mines in Neckarzimmern had been extracting gypsum for over 150 years. During World War I, they housed a dynamite factory, and from 1937, they were used to store ammunition. Whether the workers' latrines date from World War II is uncertain, as this tunnel system is one of the few that are still in use. The Iron Gate opens into a subterranean town. The mountainside is hollowed out by a road network 34 kilometers long. A gigantic arms forge was to be built here on an area of 130,000 square meters. It was partly put into operation in the spring of 1944. Today, the facility covers a total area of 170,000 square meters. Some units of the German armed forces are stationed in Neckarzimmern.
Two plants were transferred here during World War II. The production of ammunition casing of a nearby ammunition factory and a ball bearing production plant from a factory that was initially situated in Schweinfurt. When the army began to expand this installation in 1957, Europe was in the political crisis of the Cold War. Because of the threat of possible confrontation, facilities were sought that would also be nuclear bomb-proof in order to be able to store high-grade valuable parts and to continue the necessary repairs even under aggravated conditions of war.
Entsprechende Instandsetzungsarbeiten weitergeführt werden können, auch unter den verschärften Bedingungen eines hier stattfindenden Krieges.
720 people work underground here, providing supplies and repair parts for the army. The maintenance of the plant cost the German Ministry of Defense 1.6 million euros annually.
Our job these days in this underground facility is to repair and store for safekeeping sensitive materials, particularly materials which are worth being guarded. The greatest advantage here is that we have special climatic conditions, in variable air temperature and humidity, so that there is little effort involved in preserving and packaging.
Sodass wir also einen sehr geringen Aufwand in der Bereich Konservierung und Verpackung haben.
In addition, because of the few access points and ventilation shafts, the plant is also very easy to guard, so the number of guards necessary is comparably small for this gigantic installation.
Diese sehr großdimensionierte Anlage vergleichsweise gering ist.
In the same tunnels where materials are stored for the German peace missions in Kosovo and Afghanistan today, weapons of war were to be produced 60 years ago. The expansion of the tunnel system would have cost at least 50 million Reichsmarks. Only half of the project was completed by the end of the war. The ball-bearing factories in Schweinfurt in particular were the target of the Allied bomber raids. In spite of heavy losses, the Americans succeeded in razing the factories to the ground. Their main goal, however, namely to paralyze the production of supplies for Hitler's Wehrmacht, was not achieved at that stage. Up to 80% of the key war industries were to be moved underground. Along with the ball-bearing factories, these were the production plants for aircraft engines, fuel tanks, and the secret missile program of the SS. Only about 20% of these projects were put into operation. Installations that were considered essential for the war effort were well camouflaged in order to become invisible to the Allied reconnaissance planes. For instance, the gigantic fuel tanks of Nazi Germany were bunkered underground from as early as the mid-1930s. One such tank near Bremen is still in operation over 60 years later. The state-owned installations must be maintained regularly. Only trained personnel can descend into the tanks. Each of the 80 gigantic tanks holds 4,000 cubic meters of fuel. They're made of 12mm thick shipbuilding steel with a 1-meter thick concrete jacket. Everywhere in the Third Reich, the underground construction work was given the highest priority.
Die Absicht der Feinde, durch planmäßigen und massierten Bombenwurf die deutsche Rüstung zu zerschlagen, ist gescheitert. Rechtzeitig und mit deutscher Gründlichkeit wurden kriegsentscheidende Fertigungen unter die Erde verlagert.
This propaganda film is called Weapons, Hands, Hearts. It contains rare footage of the subterranean construction sites. These scenes were shot in Kala, in Thuringia, where an aircraft factory was to be built. Codename Lax. It was mostly foreign slave laborers who had to do the dirty work in the tunnels, under inhuman conditions.
On our first day, we were divided into groups. A German officer made his speech and told us, "You will work until you drop dead." 3 people had to drill holes in the tunnels, another 3 shoveled, and 1 took out the full tippers. We stood on a scaffold and drilled huge holes into the roof, 2.5 to 3 meters deep, which were filled with dynamite. Then they blasted it, and we had to get back to work and start shoveling immediately afterwards. We could not even see one another in all the dust and gases, but they were merciless. We had to carry on.
After their grueling 12-hour shift, the tens of thousands of slave laborers were given a frugal food ration. At the beginning of February 1945, even 14 to 16-year-olds were assigned to Kala in order to help with the construction.
From a technical viewpoint, the concept was rationally thought out and essential, considering the air supremacy of the Allies over Germany. But the means to realize it was sheer madness, of course.
Die Methoden waren natürlich die des hellen Wahnsinns. The
engine had to be kept running at full steam, although it was foreseeably speeding towards disaster, namely the end of the 1,000-year Reich. And the cruelties that took place was something that is beyond the understanding of a normal thinking and feeling human being.
Die dann vollzogen wurden noch, kann man eigentlich als normal denkender und fühlender Mensch nicht mehr nachvollziehen.
Die deutsche Führung verkündete, der deutsche Himmel muss und wird wieder freigekämpft werden. Unsere Erfinder und Konstrukteure werden der Masse der feindlichen Terrorbomber Flugzeuge entgegenwerfen, die in Abwehr und Angriff unbedingt siegen werden.
One of the most closely guarded new weapons of the Luftwaffe was manufactured in Kala, the jet fighter Me-262. The first aircraft was ready for takeoff in mid-February 1945.
The jet fighter looked like a fish. It was ultra-modern, very slim and presumably very fast. We'd heard some rumors that the plan was to build 1,200 fighters here every month. We just couldn't believe that. But it happened before our eyes. We were all terrified because it was obvious that if the war lasted any longer, we would not survive.
These aerial photos of Kala were taken by the US Air Force in 1945. The bunkered entrances and the freight lift at the side of the mountain are clearly discernible. Inside the mountain, the Nazis planned to build a total of 30 kilometers of passageways. At the end of the war, almost half this distance had been blasted through the rock. The tunnels that were not lined led into the actual heart of the plant. 4 gigantic subterranean halls covering 27,000 square meters, where the manufacturing was to take place.
We are in one of the huge halls which they were planning to use for the assembly of the jet fighters, the Me-262. Here the fighter was put together and then transported above ground through this large cross-section of the tunnel. Then it was hoisted up the mountain by means of an elevator, and from there it would take off.
Above the totally excavated mountain ridge, the Germans had apparently laid out a runway for this purpose. The serial production of the jet planes was only a question of time. As it happened, only few of them ever took off from there.
I remember 2 takeoffs of Me-262s. We were working outside and were able to see the sloping elevator as well as what was happening above ground. We all looked up and some were already pointing at the horizon, and then we saw this strange aircraft flying incredibly fast. One could really say that the Me-262 was another wonder weapon.
The Nazi leadership had placed great hopes on the potential of the new wonder weapon. Ultimately, however, even the state-of-the-art jet fighter was largely ineffective against the superiority of the Allied air combat forces. Up until the end of the war, hundreds of thousands of internees were transferred from the concentration camps in the east to the Reich in order to build new aircraft factories within a few months. Max Mannheimer came from Auschwitz to Mühldorf, a town by the Inn River, in February 1945.
We knew that a subterranean factory was to be built there, and we also knew that the reason for that was because the armament plants above ground were all being bombed. They decided to transfer everything under the surface of the earth. Here, for example, there should have been 3 stories underground and 3 stories above. To me, it seemed like ancient Egypt and the building of the pyramids. A lot of people running back and forth, driven by overseers, because it was a project that had to be finished very quickly.
A 5-meter thick and 400-meter long roof made of reinforced concrete would form a vault over the production halls. Some 2,000 inmates lost their lives during its construction.
The main jobs were digging, carrying iron and carrying cement. That was actually the worst command and also the most feared. The SS doctors at the time calculated that an inmate who did this job, and if he performed as he was expected to do, had a life expectancy of 60 to 80 days. And this calculation proved to be quite accurate.
When the war ended, Max Mannheimer's body weight was 37 kilos. Many of his fellow laborers did not live to see the liberation. Crammed in freight trains, they were evacuated from Mühldorf and other camps and taken to Dachau. The pictures of the dead, but also those of the survivors, shocked the free world. In a forest northeast of Nuremberg, there is another hidden portal to a tunnel, usually sealed by a concrete wall. Mining engineers have opened it in order to carry out some maintenance work. The Doggerwerk near Hersbruck is one of the biggest subterranean constructions built by the Nazis. Even today, the people in the surrounding villages in the Franconian Alb do not know how large the mysterious tunnel system in the mountain really is. The tunnels were lined in parts, but evidently never used. Once a year, Heinz Raber inspects the installation. Especially during the winter, tunnel parts cave in and must be repaired, a job which requires a lot of effort. The mining expert is well aware of how dangerous working underground is, particularly in the sections that had not been reinforced by the Nazis. Loosened blocks of stone can fall at any time.
We're now leaving the lined tunnel sections and entering the unlined ones. As you can see here, it's all sandstone without support, and the greatest risk is that piles of sandstone come loose from the roof and fall and cause depressions that can reach as far as and be seen from above ground.
The Nazis gave this installation the code name Escher 1.
We're now coming into a heading to the point where this tunnel should have been driven forward. You can see here that the boreholes for blasting, these black dots, had already been made. And if you're lucky, you can also find explosive cartridges in the boreholes next to the drill rods, like this one here, which is an original, that are still embedded in the stone. Here is one such cartridge. So the boreholes were loaded, ready to be blasted. It all stopped abruptly. They left everything behind, just as it was.
Over 9,000 inmates from the Flossenburg concentration camp were forced to work here under appalling conditions, so that the tunnels were excavated as quickly as possible. Some 3,500 of them died.
From the planned 100,000 square meters of area, only about 15,000 were completed. The excavations should have been continued in this direction, as you can see from these so-called drifts. These galleries are all 20 meters apart from one another and would have been used as production plants. The excavation works on this tunnel system began in March 1944 and continued up until May 1945. Approximately 7.5 kilometers of tunnels were dug. Parts of them, about 10%, had already been lined with concrete, while the rest is still unsupported. This underground installation was to be used for the production of BMW aircraft engines. And the aim was to transfer the manufacturing plant from above ground to a bomb-proof underground site.
The slave laborers blasted and removed 500,000 cubic meters of Dogger sandstone from the mountainside. Yet aircraft engines were never built here. By order of the American occupying power, the portals to the tunnel system were walled up after the war, and the abandoned plant fell into oblivion. Every now and again, former concentration camp inmates come here in order to commemorate their murdered companions. There was one new type of weapon on which the Nazi leadership pinned their hopes, that would bring a decisive turn in the course of the war. In the propaganda jargon of the Third Reich, it was called V2. V stood for vengeance. Missile engineer Wernher von Braun had developed in Peenemünde a new ballistic missile of the type A4 to a stage where it was ready for production. With the V2, the Nazis wanted to bomb targets in England and thus terrorize the British civilian population. Despite numerous unsuccessful launch attempts, the V2 was operational in the summer of 1944. An inconspicuous mountain ridge in the Harz region. In mid-April 1945, American troops advanced to the town of Nordhausen. In the shadows of the Kornstein mountain, they found a concentration camp with emaciated inmates and many corpses. Here, survivors of the Mittelbau-Dora camp report to their liberators details of mysterious tunnels in the mountain and a top-secret missile factory where they had to work as slave laborers of the SS. Yet the victors had long known that one of the most important arms forges of the Third Reich was here. After the British carried out a devastating bomb raid on the Peenemünde plant, the Nazis quickly transferred the missile production to an already existing underground fuel tank in August 1943. Concentration camp inmates had to begin excavating immediately, under the cruelest of conditions.
Die 10.000 Häftlinge
The 10,000 inmates were put up in 4 cross-cut connecting chambers of the tunnel system, which meant that they slept where they had to work. They were totally inadequately dressed for the conditions they faced here below ground. They just wore their thin striped prisoners' uniforms in the cold, and the air was very humid. This, of course, quickly resulted in the spreading of pulmonary diseases, and it was no surprise that many of the 3,000 fatalities during the first 5 months were caused by tuberculosis and other lung diseases. All the others died of exhaustion, starvation, or froze to death, but also from maltreatment by the SS and the civilian employees of the plant.
Und nicht zu schweigen von den Misshandlungen durch SS-Personal, aber auch durch zivile Angestellte des Mittelwerkes.
The 250,000 square meter tunnel system in Kornstein is largely closed today. Being in the unlined tunnels is extremely dangerous. Only the men of the Mines Safety Authority go in periodically to inspect the plant. However, treasure or souvenir hunters often attempt to enter the tunnels illegally, as original pieces from the mountain where the missiles were built are very sought after by collectors. Peter Wolf was brought to Mittelbau-Dora from Auschwitz. As a Jewish inmate, he was given the camp number 105065. His memories are so dreadful that he does not want to enter the tunnels again.
We were inmates in the camp at Nordhausen. A train took us every morning and drove us to the tunnels. We were considered the death commando, and people called us that too. Working outside was somewhat easier, if you can use that word, compared to inside, because inside one was under constant SS supervision, and people were beaten all the time. The inmates before us never saw daylight. They were in the tunnels 24 hours a day. They slept, ate, and worked underground. The conditions were murderous, and the brutality of the SS beyond description. A lot of people died in there.
These memories demonstrate the unspeakable suffering of the slave laborers. Today, the interior of the mountain is still littered with debris. It's almost unimaginable that an entire factory was once in operation here. The Armament Ministry had assigned 200 million Reichsmarks for the creation of a gigantic subterranean industrial area of 600,000 square meters in total. The production of the V missiles was at its core. 1,000 rockets were to be produced per month, according to the ambitious plan. In April 1944, the output was 450, and even this number was rarely achieved, as the production seldom ran smoothly.
It was not an ordinary factory, in the sense that the product which was being manufactured was not ready to go into mass production. Almost on a daily basis, Peenemünde, the development plant of the A4 missile, would send orders to alter the production process, and these modifications were then adapted into production here. As a result, more than half of the rockets produced were not fully operational.
funktionsbereit waren.
Rare color pictures taken by Hitler's cameraman Walter Frenz. Under the instructions of German technicians, selected prisoners put the missiles together from some 45,000 component parts. The assembled V2s were taken to Tunnel 41 for the final inspection. The 15-meter-tall testing tower is almost completely underwater today. From here, the missiles were loaded onto freight trains and transported to the launching sites in northern Germany and occupied Holland. After the end of the war, first the British and then the Americans collected everything that could be of use from the plant. Then the Soviets came and took whatever was left. Yet in Tunnel 29, relics of the underground missile production can still be found. Jet engines and other parts rust away in the water. They are the last remnants of the insane idea to transfer most of the Third Reich's armament production under the earth. Whether the deployment of a great number of operational missiles would have influenced the outcome of the war is questionable. In Kornstein, however, their production plant was almost unassailable.
The Allies had extensive and detailed information about what was happening here, chiefly through the evaluation of aerial reconnaissance photos. For example, they'd located and knew exactly where the ventilation shafts were in Kornstein, and they thought long and hard about whether they could drop phosphorus or other incendiary bombs into the shafts in order to bombard the underground factory and render it obsolete.
Die Untertageanlage zu bombardieren und unbrauchbar zu machen.
US Army footage from April 12, 1945. The whole horror of the Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp revealed itself to the liberators after a British bomb raid had heavily damaged the Bulka death camp. This was where the emaciated SS slaves were brought to die. Annihilation through work.
Somehow you get used to seeing dead people all around you. Early every morning, each block had to report for roll call. Everyone had to be counted, even those who had died during the night, so we had to lay them on one side. We were always happy to survive the day. I'm often asked, why did you not offer any resistance to the SS troopers? And I always reply, if we were still alive by the evening, we had offered enough resistance the whole day.
Wir bringen die ersten Aufnahmen von V2 auf ihrem Flug nach England. Sie wurden aus Gründen der Geheimhaltung aus größerer Entfernung gemacht und geben nur einen schwachen Begriff vom wirklichen Größenverhältnis der V2. In rasender Geschwindigkeit steigt der schlanke Stahlleib in die Stratosphäre.
The chief destination of the destructive weapon was London. On September 7, 1944, the first V2 struck at the heart of the British capital. Tens of thousands more would follow. At least that was what the Nazi leadership was planning. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels gloated. The first successful strikes of V2 missiles were unscrupulously exploited on the home front.
Ich habe damals nach den schweren Angriffen auf die Reichshauptstadt in Berlin erklärt, es wird die Stunde kommen, wo wir das den Engländern heimzahlen werden. Die englische Presse hat mich am anderen Tag auf das Massivste angegriffen und die höhnische Frage aufgeworfen, ob die neue Waffe die ich dort angekündigt hätte, etwa im Propagandaministerium statt im Rüstungsministerium erfunden worden wäre. Ich habe es damals nicht für meine Aufgabe gehalten, die Engländer eines Besseren zu belehren, sondern ich war im Gegenteil der Überzeugung, je länger sie glauben, dass sie nicht kommt, umso besser ist es. Denn Überraschung ist auch eine Waffe.
Initially, the Nazi leaders had planned to launch the V missiles from gigantic launching bunkers. In May 1943, construction of a concrete colossus 40 meters wide and 75 meters long began in Watten in northern France. The German engineers believed that the 5-meter thick reinforced concrete roof was impenetrable. British bombers proved them wrong in the summer of 1944. The incomplete base was severely damaged by bombs and became useless for launching V missiles. The interior of the Mammoth installation was converted after the raid and was used for the production of fuel. A true-to-scale model of the V2 reminds us today of the original purpose of the plant. From the Wehrmacht's viewpoint, the destruction of Watten was a tactical error on the part of the Allies, as the bombing led to new launch possibilities being considered. The missiles, according to the plans supported by Professor von Braun, should be launched from a number of mobile ramps. These easily camouflaged launching sites could not be identified in time by the enemy. It would be difficult for Allied bomber pilots to locate and destroy such targets.
Oh yeah, we knew all about the danger of this. The V2s, especially when they started coming, they used to blow those off from France and they would come down somewhere in England. This is rather pretty horrifying, really. For people who obviously knew more about it, like for instance Churchill, it was crucial because he was thinking about morale as well. Whereas to us, of course, it was merely another job. We realised the importance of it and to get on with it and do the job, but we had nothing about the far-reaching implications of it.
The 617th Squadron of the Royal Air Force, also called the Dam Busters, was put into action every time British intelligence had identified military point targets, such as the launching sites of V-rockets. In the northern French town of Wizernes stands perhaps the most spectacular subterranean bunker built by the Nazis. From here, the vengeance weapons would be launched in great numbers. The locals call the gigantic roof construction la coupole, the dome. Inside, the missiles would be fitted with warheads in an assembly line style of production. According to the plans of the Nazis, the operational missiles would then be transported to a former quarry and be launched immediately. The storage capacity was 500 missiles. Starting from an old quarry, thousands of slave laborers had to blast open kilometers of tunnels into the mountain under inhuman conditions. The concrete dome was 5 meters thick and weighed 55,000 tons. It would form a protective vault over the heart of the unit. The excavation work in the interior had begun. Here, the missiles were to be uprighted for the final assembly, the fitting of the warheads. The octagonal hall is 13 meters high. Yet, not long after construction had begun, the Brits heard about the plant and ordered the dam busters to destroy it.
It was important in fact, that we knocked it down before it started sending all these dreadful things over to us. We were thoroughly briefed because we were told everything they knew about them. The whole idea of it as well was to undermine targets. So it had a dual effect. If you've got a direct hit, it will blow the place up and blow it completely to smithereens. And at the same time, it would undermine all the foundations.
British military engineers had developed a special type of bomb for this purpose. The 12,000-pound tall boys could penetrate through meters of solid concrete. On July the 17th, 1944, these bombs were used to attack Wizernes. Although the planes of the 617th Bomber Squadron did not manage to land a direct strike on the dome, the entire plant became ineffective after the raid.
Well, we get the information because the photo aeroplanes came back. Almost immediately they were over there and they got the photo and they'd come back and we would be told how successful the raid was and also, you know, if you had to go again. Because with tall boys, you normally didn't have to go again if it was successful, see.
11 days prior to that, the dam busters had also attacked Mimoyek, a small village just a few kilometers away from the Channel coast to the south of Calais. By command of Nazi armament minister Speer, the building of another subterranean plant had begun here in the summer of 1943 for the production of a weapon which was to reach London directly, just like the V2. One single tall boy bomb was enough to end Hitler's dream of the so-called England cannon. The bomb broke through the 6-meter thick concrete roof and exploded inside the mountain. Slave laborers had blasted 100-meter-long shafts diagonally into the mountain to accommodate entire batteries of new high-pressure pumps. These cannons, also called V3 or Busy Lizzies, were supposed to fire shells to distances of up to 200 kilometers. It's not clear which kind of shells the England cannon was to fire at a speed of 1 kilometer per second. Theories exist that mention biological or chemical weapons, but there's no evidence to support them. After the successful bombing raid, the installation was useless but not completely destroyed. Today, a few of the 60-year-old tunnels are still accessible. A model of the so-called millipede reminds us of the magnitude of the plan the Nazis tried to achieve here. The threat for England had obviously been so great, the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill concerned himself with Mimoyek for 8 months after the liberation of France. He could not allow this installation to pose a threat to the safety of the country, he wrote in a confidential memorandum. As a result, the V3 shafts that were not destroyed in the raid were blasted by British engineers. Did Churchill know more about the plans of the Nazis than is known today? An obsolete railway track leads into no man's land. Falkenhagen, southeast of Berlin. British records concerning this small place in Brandenburg's countryside are partly classified to this day. The reason is that here was to be produced one of the most dangerous weapons of mass destruction in the history of war.
Unter Gas verstehen wir jene Erzeugnisse der chemischen Industrie, die als chemische Kampfstoffe bei Kampfhandlungen eingesetzt werden können, mit dem Ziel, auf den Gegner einzuwirken und ihn kampfunfähig zu machen. So hat sich die chemische Waffe von Hunderten von Geistern und Kräften geschmiedet, schon im Ersten Weltkrieg zu einem wirkungsvollen Kampfinstrument entwickelt. Wir müssen daher auch im gegenwärtigen Völkerringen jederzeit mit ihrem Einsatz durch den Gegner rechnen.
A Wehrmacht instructional film. The effects of the toxic substances mustard gas and hydrocyanic acid were demonstrated on living objects. Great Britain, the United States and the Soviet Union stockpiled large amounts of these warfare agents during the Second World War. Nazi Germany also had some 55,000 tons. Yet these lethal gases were not used. The memories of the terrors caused by the use of gas in the First World War were too dreadful. Dr. Hoffmann, a physicist and former member of the GDR's Academy of Sciences, has been investigating the history of Falkenhagen for decades. In 1938, the military had built the unit in a large, densely forested area to protect it from inquisitive eyes. Under the codename Seewerk, scientists here developed mostly incendiary substances. Incomplete parts of buildings testify to a project which was started here in 1944. The Army Supreme Command had made the grounds available to IG Farben. The chemical concern was to produce a completely new chemical warfare agent. 44 million Reichsmarks were apportioned for the construction. A gigantic thermal power station was already structurally complete. The chemists had already transferred their labs to Falkenhagen.
There was a new process development, and that was the nerve agent Sarin. This warfare agent was to be produced in a large plant here in Falkenhagen. Sarin mainly affects the respiratory system. The concentration of one droplet which evaporates into a cubic meter of air is sufficient, and when one comes into contact with this agent, death by respiratory failure will result within 6 minutes.
Innerhalb von 6 Minuten bei schlagendem Herzen erstickt. Die Atmung wird außer Gefecht gesetzt.
The traditional chemical weapons that were known at the time would have been recognized by the soldiers on both sides. The use of protective gas masks was practiced over and over again. Sarin, however, was different. One could neither see it, nor smell or taste it. With sarin, death came with no warning. It's said that Hitler had forbidden the use of gas because he'd almost lost his eyesight after a gas attack during the First World War. At the same time, however, he personally ordered the production of sarin. Would he have had the nerve to use this new weapon if it had been available? With a month's production of sarin, the Nazis would have been able to eradicate the population of a city as large as London. When the Red Army reached the borders of the Third Reich at the beginning of 1945, the German chemists in Falkenhagen packed up their equipment and left. Nothing should give the victors any clues about their plans. Sarin was never produced here. The Soviet conquerors used the production tract for breeding pigs.
After the war, people were rendered speechless when they realized the disastrous potential of what was in preparation here. This chemical warfare agent was a purely German invention and was totally unknown to the Allies. 500 tons monthly is a vast amount, and with artillery shells or bombs, one could have exterminated whole areas. With such a weapon, one does not distinguish between civilians and soldiers.
An 80-meter-long subterranean duct is what remains of the semi-finished filling plant for sarin. IG Farben had announced that production could commence in the summer of 1945. How realistic that was can no longer be established today. American tank units advancing into Austria in early May 1945. The sorry remains of the Wehrmacht had surrendered to the superiority of the Allies and become prisoners of war. Footage from the end of the war near Salzburg, filmed by a cameraman of the US Army. On May the 8th, 2 days after the Ebensee concentration camp was liberated by the Americans, war correspondents documented the suffering of the survivors. Concentration camp inmates and slave laborers from Ebensee had been toiling in an SS secret tunnel system close to the camp, codename Cement. Today, a diesel locomotive drives into the mountain once a day in order to remove the lime that is mined there. 60 years ago, the Nazis expropriated the family business and gave it to the SS for the production of the most spectacular new development in the field of military engineering. The plant was never put into operation. However, especially in the former Tunnel A, the initial purpose can still be identified. The halls in which intercontinental missiles were to be assembled under the supervision of SS Obergruppenführer Hans Kammler are 30 meters high. The newest missile model, the 26-meter-tall A9, was supposed to have a strike range that would reach as far as the USA, according to the ambitious plans of the Nazis. 20 such rockets would be built monthly in Ebensee. The A9 project did not even reach the testing stage. Its inventor, Wernher von Braun, was taken to the USA without further questioning after the end of the war, where he continued his missile research for his new masters. The precise number of the victims of his work while in Hitler's service is unknown. At the end of World War II, the victors found gigantic unfinished systems of tunnels all over Nazi Germany. It's said that the existence of some of them was unknown even to Hitler. Entering the remains of the mysterious tunnels today involves a certain amount of risk. 60 years ago, Allied bomb squadrons tried to destroy the subterranean shelters by using special bombs. Some of the intricate underground installations, however, still look as if the war here ended only yesterday. The insane construction project collapsed, together with the Third Reich and its dictator. A bomb-proof headquarters was also being built in Hitler's mountain hideout at Obersalzberg. To this day, the structure has not been explored in its entirety. All that remains from the Berghof are the catacombs. Allied bombs razed the dictator's chalet to the ground. The bunkers became an attraction for the victors. This is where the dictator was supposed to survive the bombs and even the fall of his empire. The Eulengebirge, a region in former Lower Silesia. Here in the mountain ridges close to the Polish town of Glusha is hidden one of the most curious legacies of the Third Reich. Two amateur historians, a Pole and a German, made it their business to explore the peculiar subterranean facilities. Somewhere in the forest of the so-called Boozer's Heights, a mysterious chasm leads 48 meters deep into the earth. The experts believe it to be an unfinished elevator shaft. Jacek Duszak, a teacher in Poland, and Jürgen Müller of the association Berlin's Underworlds have been coming to this place for many years in order to find new evidence. Not least the gigantic timber-lined hall proves that the Nazis were planning great things here.
In total, there are 7 underground tunnel systems. Only a very small part of them, maybe 1/8, was concreted. The rest are tunnels that are only partly supported with timber trunks and beams. Around 40,000 people were used as forced laborers in this entire area in the Eulengebirge. The temperature in the tunnels was about 8 degrees, and the laborers worked shifts of 10 or 12 hours a day. One can imagine that all this, along with a poor diet, caused many people to die.
Dann können Sie sich vorstellen, dass bei schlechter Ernährung, dass es da sehr viele Tote gab.
When the Soviets conquered Lower Silesia at the end of April 1945, they found the gigantic construction site abandoned. At first, they did not realize the sense or purpose of it.
Actually, these bunkers were always accessible after the end of the war. All the witnesses who were here after the Germans pulled out agreed that the place looked as if the workers had just left for their lunch break. The drill rods were still in the walls, spades lay around everywhere, tippers and dump trucks were filled with rubble. Everything appeared as if the workers were having a short break and would get back to work soon.
Czy zrobiono przerwę na odpoczynek i za chwilę zjawią się robotnicy z powrotem i rozpoczną pracę.
Concreted rooms for the guards and battlements for machine guns demonstrate the importance of the installation. Under strictest secrecy, a new headquarters for the Führer was being built here from November 1943. Codename Reza. Apparently, Hitler considered the Wolfschanze, his main field headquarters in East Prussia, no longer safe enough. For the building of a bomb-proof underground town for 20,000 people in the Eulengebirge, Armament Minister Speer granted 130 million Reichsmarks. An area of 40,000 square meters was to be ready for occupancy in August 1945. Many of the slave laborers used for the building of Reza were detailed from the Grossrossen concentration camp. In early 1945, the camp had some 75,000 inmates, while about 13,000, mostly Jewish prisoners from Auschwitz, were put up in outcamps in the Eulengebirge. Approximately half of them did not survive the labor for the safety of the dictator. The slave laborers had dug 3 kilometers of tunnels into the Wolfsberg, the largest complex among the systems planned in the Eulengebirge. Today, parts of the intricate tunnel system are underwater. The 2 explorers venture into the labyrinth cautiously. According to statements made by the site managers, about 55% of the planning stage was completed by November 1944. Excavations were to commence immediately. Exact assessments about the intended extent of the subterranean bunkers are not easy to make, as the original building plans for the Reza project disappeared after the end of the war. Jacek Duszak and Jürgen Müller are convinced that there are still many undiscovered underground installations in the Eulengebirge. According to the few remaining documents of the Nazis, plans also included the production of so-called Wunderwaffen in a gigantic subterranean factory. However, 60 years later, it's difficult to distinguish between fact and fiction.
We have information that all prisoners were evacuated at the end of the war, except for some who were ordered to camouflage the installations. Apparently, they disappeared without a trace, and so did their supervisors. Of course, this is all unconfirmed information. The Nazis had plenty of time to camouflage the tunnels. It is very difficult today to find the sealed portals because they were filled in skillfully. Now trees grow on the soil. They covered their tracks really well.
Fürstenstein Castle near Waldenburg was once the residence of the princes of Pless. In 1940, the spacious property of the relatives of Churchill was sequestered. 4 years later, some extensive renovation work began. Officially, the plan was to convert the Baroque jewel into a house for guests of the Nazi government. In reality, the castle was for Adolf Hitler and his minions. 35 architects from Speer's staff worked under strictest secrecy on a subterranean shelter system with direct access to the castle. In case of an emergency, an elevator would take the Führer from his chambers 50 meters deep into the mountain. The dictator and his closest entourage were supposed to have 3,200 square meters of floor space.
The basic idea, among other things, was that this was to become Hitler's last headquarters. Also, each of the leading personalities of the Third Reich would have their own subterranean shelter system. For example, there would be one for Goebbels, one for Himmler, and so on. Of course, the supreme commanders of the Wehrmacht, with Keitel and Jodl, would move in there too. For that reason, precise blueprints existed as to who was getting how many cubic meters.
Newsreel footage from the Wolfschanze near Rastenburg in the summer of 1944, as Hitler paid farewell to Benito Mussolini. The Führer's headquarters in East Prussia lay on an area of 250 hectares and was protected by 3 heavily guarded no-go zones. The railway tracks which the allies of the Third Reich used when visiting the headquarters are now overgrown. The former Wolfschanze is a field of rubble. Before they withdrew, the Germans blew up all the buildings, and the Red Army did the rest. Hitler's private shelter is a bulky lump. In 1944, all important structures in the innermost no-go zone were vaulted by massive reinforced concrete domes. Rokas Misch had not been to Rastenburg since the end of 1944. He was a member of the Führer's escort commando, so he was almost always at Hitler's side in the Wolfschanze. Returning here after 60 years is completely different from how the dictator's former bodyguard had imagined it. It's difficult now for him to recognize anything in the ruins.
It's a massive construction. Before, the residential shelters were 2, maybe 3 meters high at the most, and now it's so enormous. I'm amazed at what has become of it. I can still remember very clearly how everything used to look here, and all that had happened so fast, it's incredible.
Das ist in einem Rückzugverfahren passiert. Unglaublich, aber wahr. Wie schnell die das gemacht haben. In ein paar Wochen.
Within a few weeks, the whole grounds here had changed. Just in a few weeks. Before, there were just some flat huts. If you came through there was a big room to the right with a long table where the briefings took place. It was quite cramped. It was not large. The massive structures were built afterwards.
Das war nicht groß. Das Gewaltige ist nahe entstanden.
When Hitler came from Berchtesgaden with his retinue to his new headquarters in East Prussia in mid-July 1944, his private bunker was not yet finished, so the dictator stayed at the visitors' shelter. Temporarily, the briefings took place in a nearby wooden cabin, and this was the case at noon on July the 20th, 1944. Hitler had asked his generals to present their reports. Some adjutants and servants were also in the room. Around 16 minutes to 1, the commander-in-chief bent over a big map table exactly here. At that moment, a bomb exploded. Colonel von Stauffenberg had placed it under the table. The explosion killed 4 and seriously injured 7. The cabin was almost completely destroyed. Hitler, protected from the heavy map table, suffered only minor injuries. The coup in Berlin failed on the same night. Still, the security measures after the assassination attempt were not tightened significantly.
He was never visibly scared. We never noticed that he was afraid in any way. When someone called his attention to it for whatever reason, he would always say, "I'll be fine, nothing will happen to me." Also, there weren't any changes as such, nothing at all. Everything was just as it was, as in the days before the attempt. The 20th of July happened, and in the following days, everything went on as usual. There was a reception for Mussolini, and then there were some other receptions, as if nothing had happened at all.
Only Hitler's closest aides knew the construction of a gigantic subterranean headquarters in Lower Silesia was in progress. He hoped that Reza would be ready soon. In there, he would be safe from enemy paratroopers and Allied bomber squadrons. At that time, Hitler spent very little time in Berlin. The Reich's capital was under attack by British and American bombers on an almost daily basis. In spite of the looming defeat, most Germans in 1944 still believed in and trusted their Führer. In order to boost the endurance of the population, air raid shelters have been constructed in all the major cities of Nazi Germany. What was probably the largest shelter has remained almost intact in Dortmund. The entrances are camouflaged, as the risk for uninvited guests would be far too great.
Here we have a typical characteristic feature of air raid shelters. These gas locks are always equipped with a door buffer. One could create an overpressure in the installation, so if there was a gas attack outside, one could prevent the gas from penetrating into the shelters.
After the first major Allied attacks on Dortmund, the public air raid shelters proved insufficient and offered only inadequate protection. As a result, excavations began for a gigantic tunnel system under the city.
Here in this area should be a cut for an opening to ground level. It was done from below, from the shelter to the surface. As you can see, the work was not finished. This here is the original rock as it was left after the blasting. It has just been lying like that for almost 60 years now.
When was the project abandoned?
Right at the end of the war. There'd been work going on in the bunker up until the end of the war. We have billing documents from April 1945 from which we can establish that people still worked here. You can also see that some tools were left behind too. The building site was abandoned just as it is today.
"80,000 people would have been able to get out of danger from the bombs in shelters up to 16 meters under the surface of the earth. 5 kilometers of the tunnel system were finished. It's said that after the end of the war, criminals would sometimes escape from the police into this underworld. They used the abandoned tunnel system as storage for stolen goods. The shelters were never used. Only few people in Dortmund today know that the bowels of their city are hollow. In the 1960s, a proposal to use the bunkers within the remit of the civil air defense was rejected. Today, the installations stand empty.
We're now coming into the area underneath Körnerplatz. Here we have a beautiful plan from 1943. You can see how the shelters would have looked if the planned work had been finished. This room here would have 2 stories then, lined with wood in order to keep out the humidity and make it a little bit warmer. It would all be divided up with corridors and individual cabins with fresh air and exhaust ducts, but obviously it never got to this stage. The end of the war caught up with the construction work. Now, let's move on.
There are no plans for public use of the shelters. The state authorities see to it that the galleries do not cave in.
Ein Querschnitt durch den Berliner Sonntag im 5. Kriegssommer.
Newsreel footage from Berlin. The Nazi propaganda tried to persuade the people that there was some kind of normality in their everyday life. Yet the truth could not be withheld completely.
Die Uniform beherrscht das Straßenbild. In dem durch Terrorangriffe mehrfach schwer heimgesuchten Berliner Zoo, der vor genau 100 Jahren eröffnet wurde. Freibad Wannsee hat von der alten Anziehungskraft nichts eingebüßt.
The idyllic atmosphere from the capital was deceptive. People were rarely safe. Allied bombs fell on Berlin almost daily. A subterranean air raid shelter testifies to the problems and the fears of the community. Almost every night, residents and travelers gathered here, as the installation had been integrated into a subway station. When the sirens wailed, people often had just a few minutes to reach the bomb-proof chambers. On February 3, 1945, 1,000 American bombers launched an all-out bombing raid on the Reich's capital. The first bomb struck the city center at 2 minutes past 11.
It suddenly became very, very quiet. One felt that something had hit the shelter, not because it was so loud, but because the noise was more like a thud. It was a very ominous moment and very frightening because one didn't really know whether the shelter would hold out. The bombs struck downstairs, where we would usually be, down at the entrances. Afterwards, we saw many dead bodies lying down there. It was only by chance that we were on the 3rd floor on that day, and so we survived the bombing.
Entire districts were in flames. Day turned into night from the smoke. A firestorm raged for hours.
When we finally came out, I think we must have been sitting in there for 2 or 3 hours. I couldn't recognize anything. The whole area looked so different that I asked myself how our mother would find her way to our home. The kiosk was gone, everything was in flames, the street was like a fire tunnel.
Many thousands died during this air raid on Berlin, the heaviest of the war. Hundreds of thousands became homeless. Little was left from the former glamour of the Third Reich. Hitler's architect, Albert Speer, was supposed to realize the Führer's sinister visions, but construction had long been suspended, and the few structures that had been completed were converted to accommodate the war effort. Somewhere in Berlin's zoo, the Tiergarten, can still be found the meticulously concealed entrance to a street tunnel of Hitler's world capital, Germania. Nobody has been in there for years. Dietmar Arnold from the association Berlin's Underworlds ventures in. It's a risky undertaking, as poisonous gases may have formed underground.
We're now almost 9 meters under the Tiergarten in the western tunnel of the main junction. It was planned to be an expressway or motorway tunnel, 90 meters long, 14 meters wide, 4.8 meters high. These are remains of Germania. The junction was to be the intersection of the planned east-west and north-south connections. Large parts of the east-west connection were indeed built, which today are the Straße des 17. Juni and Unter den Linden. But the north-south connection was never built. This is what remains of those ambitious plans. This tunnel was only rediscovered in 1967. The roof has been renovated, as you can see here. They worked out that it was cheaper to preserve the building than to fill it in.
Cars have never driven through this tunnel. At some point during the war, a partition wall must have been built. Armament plants would have continued their production here in a bomb-proof environment. The only reminder of it today is a rusty lamp. At the far end of the tunnel, Dietmar Arnold has found proof that the tunnel was also used by Berlin's population as an air raid shelter during the bomb attacks.
This is the access stairway through which people would come down. I think it's really interesting how worn down these stairs are. There must have been masses of people who used these narrow steps to enter this tunnel. And this here may have been an emergency door to the shelter.
Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels was concerned that the unrelenting airstrikes could shake morale on the home front. His staff secretly filmed these scenes from Berlin on his behalf. The population never got to see such footage. By that time, the Nazi leadership appeared only rarely in public. Goebbels visited the ruins of St. Hedwig's Cathedral, demonstrating his determination for the newsreel. The minister had a private bunker under his official villa in the center of the government district. The rest of the installations were discovered accidentally during some construction work in 1998. Little is known about the interior furnishings of the shelters. Goebbels' diaries indicate that he and his family used the shelter often. Apparently, the chambers were not luxuriously furnished. Nevertheless, the propaganda minister was able to maintain constant contact with the outside world by means of modern telephone fittings. Despite vigorous conservationist protests, the rest of the underground installations were filled in soon after their discovery. A private film of the Goebbels family from 1943 shows how things may have looked down there.
Aufstehen. Aufstehen. Helgerchen, komm her da. Schnell rauf. Holly, steh schon auf. Zieh dich schon an. Ich bin doch Kind. Ja, schon, Mensch.
Magda Goebbels was one of the most ardent supporters of Hitler from the early days. When the downfall of the Nazi Empire became inevitable, she did not hesitate for 1 second. She and her family committed suicide in the Führer's bunker. At the end of April 1945, the dictator barricaded himself in the bunker under the Chancellery in Berlin and waited for a miracle. Raucous Misch accompanied his Führer through this final act.
Hitler's death dragged on from the 22nd to the 30th of April. It was postponed from one day to the next. Actually, Hitler wanted to put an end to it on the 22nd, after he had dismissed everyone. I will stay here, he said. I'm not leaving Berlin. But everyone else should go and leave him behind. He was ready to take his own life. But then the radio operator picked up a communication of the Western Allies that said the Germans absolutely must continue to defend Berlin for another 2 or 3 weeks. When Hitler was informed, he said they should have thought of it earlier. The war is lost now.
Das hat man Hitler mitgeteilt und da hat Hitler gesagt, das hätte sich früher überlegen sollen, der Krieg ist doch verloren.
On the afternoon of April the 30th, the dictator and his newly wedded wife, Eva Braun, retired to their underground chambers to commit suicide.
It was as silent as a church. You couldn't hear a sound. Everyone was whispering. Then someone shouted, Linge, Linge. Linge was Hitler's manservant. I think it's done. Then the door opened and I looked in, of course. Then the next person went in and another door was opened, and then I saw Hitler slumped by the couch. Or maybe he had collapsed on the armchair next to it. I'm not 100% certain anymore. I also saw Eva lying there with her knees tucked up.
On the following day, the Red Army stormed into the center of Berlin. On May 1st, 1945, in the bunker of the Chancellery, Joseph Goebbels held the position with a few loyal followers. "When we make our exit, the world shall tremble," the propaganda minister had written in his diary 2 weeks previously. The victors of Berlin inspected the ruins of Hitler's center of power. The world that will come after the Führer and National Socialism is not worth living in. Magda Goebbels used these words to justify her taking the lives of her children before she committed suicide with her husband. The victors found their bodies in the garden of the Chancellery of the Reich.
At Merkers, Germany, this salt mine holds one of the strangest secrets of the war. A secret that was to deal Germany a crushing financial blow during the last days of the conflict. Here, GIs uncovered a fabulous hoard of jewelry, silver, currency, bullion, and art treasures. Much of it the accumulated loot of 5 years of war. Practically every museum in Europe is represented in these masterpieces, which include Raphael's, Rembrandt's, Van Dyck's, and many other great masters' works, buried now 1,200 feet below the ground in what the Nazis considered a safe hiding place and a bomb-proof shelter.
The tunnels of the former potassium mines in Kaiserode crisscross large areas of southern Thuringia. Over the course of decades, miners have dug hundreds of kilometers on several levels through the saline soil. The complex system of tunnels resembles a maze. If something was to be hidden here, chances are it would not be found. After the demise of East Germany, hardly any salt has been mined around the village of Merkers. The mine owners are hoping for greater profits from tourism. The history of the incredible discovery of the treasure in 1945 is supposed to fire the visitor's imagination. Maybe something could still be hidden here. The story of the spectacular deposits has been accurately reconstructed.
In February and March 1945, this stretch of tunnel we are covering now was used as storage for the gold and monetary reserves of Nazi Germany. After the devastating air raid on Berlin, according to the records, Walter Funk, the president of the Reichsbank at the time, decided to move the gold reserves to a safe place. The location they chose was the mine Kaiserroda 23, the modern-day Merkers. By the beginning of March, the reserves had been transported by freight trains and stored here. Most of the workers in the mine were foreign displaced persons. Only the security personnel and the overseers were German. It must have been common knowledge among the foreign workers and prisoners of war who worked in the mine that the gold of the Nazis was stored here. For this reason, when the Americans took Merkers on April the 4th, it didn't take long before they tracked down the treasure and came into this chamber we're in now.
American financial and art experts immediately began to examine the treasure. It was quickly established that the hoard constituted the gold and monetary reserves of the Third Reich, as well as the art collections of Berlin's museums. Few stolen cultural assets were found here. At a later point, the Allies found many of the art treasures the Nazis had looted from all over Europe in some other mines in the south of Germany and Austria. Some valuable items are still missing today. Little by little, the Allied armies occupied all of Nazi Germany. On April the 22nd, 1945, American and French army units took Stuttgart. The remaining German troops did not defend the city and capitulated to the Allied supremacy. A bunker that testifies to the final combat for Stuttgart has been preserved deep inside the Killersberg. It appears that the Wehrmacht leaders in Stuttgart coordinated their pointless mission from this command post. Communication officers received commands that never reached most of the soldiers above. The rooms seem untouched, as if the war ended only yesterday. The safe appears to have been opened by force. The remains of a gas mask lie on the floor. The door to the police office is riddled with bullet holes. Did a last exchange of fire with the henchmen of the regime take place here? Did someone sacrifice his life for his Führer, although everything was already lost? For a long time, the Allies were concerned that Hitler, together with his last loyal supporters, would barricade himself at Obersalzberg, where the Nazi leadership had kept a hermetically sealed safe haven since the 1930s. During the war, the Führer and his retinue had often come to Berchtesgaden, and whenever Hitler stayed up here, he was always heavily guarded by security forces and SS troopers. Descent into the underworld of the Nazi mountain. A team of surveyors systematically explores and measures the subterranean shelters. Directly from the Obersalzberg Records Office, a shaft leads 30 meters down into the earth. Nobody knows exactly what is hidden down there. The wooden staircase collapsed decades ago. The surveyor team and their equipment are cautiously lowered with an elaborately secured motorized rope elevator. At the bottom of the shaft, the experts expect to find the entrance to a half-finished SS shelter. They find 350 meters of largely unsupported tunnels. Only the first caverns have been lined with bricks, and the cable shafts concreted in parts. The advance ends 60 meters deep in the rock. Florian Bayerl is one of the most knowledgeable experts as far as Obersalzberg is concerned. He's been investigating its history since his youth and has also interviewed many witnesses of the time. Bayerl knows that the interior of the Brown Mountain looks like a burrow. The system of tunnels and bunkers is almost 6 kilometers long, and apparently even bigger installations were planned. Here, people worked 3 shifts a day until just before the end of the war. The drills of the miners were resharpened around the clock in order to keep up the pace. The workforce was so large that people often stood in each other's way. Moreover, those who wanted to shirk the Sunday shift risked a confrontation with the site manager and the security troops.
This is actually the last unexplored and unregistered section of the Obersalzberg bunkers. It's an SS shelter that was laid out at an enormous depth, far under the existing tunnels. Due to this long shaft, which was built under here, it was not accessible. But now digital surveying technology has enabled us for the first time to form a precise and complete picture of all the subterranean installations under the Obersalzberg. When you study the records of the Obersalzberg Council regarding the tunnel structures and fuse them with the testimonies of witnesses of that time, you come to the conclusion that this whole tunneled area was intended to be protection shelters for approximately 400 SS troopers. At the same time, however, these gigantic halls that we discovered here today were designed to be large ammunition depots for the defense of what we presume was an Alpine fortress.
Also, the readings show that the shelter structures of Hitler's Berghof begin no more than 10 meters away. Was the SS also supposed to be deployed underground for the Führer's defense?
A total of 3,000 laborers worked in the tunnels of Obersalzberg. When you look at this section here, you can see different stages of development, from the unlined crumbly rock that is still predominant here to the semi-finished final stage of construction, as we can see around us here, with the drain tiles. With the same workforce numbers, one would certainly need to work another 4 to 5 months in order to finish this tunnel system and be able to use it as an air raid shelter.
It was Hitler's notorious secretary, Martin Borman, who directed the construction of the subterranean air raid shelter installations at Obersalzberg. Borman had a spacious bunker constructed for his large family too. Today, it may be entered only with a special permit. "77 steps led directly from Borman's house down into the underworld. An almost 60-meter long corridor led into the private chambers. Sheltered machine gun posts were built in for protection against enemy intruders.
The entire Obersalzberg shelter complex was completely autonomous as far as supplies were concerned. An independent water supply was available, there was a poison gas-proof ventilating system and a store of food supplies. It would have been possible to hold out here for a long period of time. The only problem would have been that they could not guard the entrances from the outside, but only from within. There were no fortifications on the outside, which means that the enemy, during a siege, could penetrate into the shelters up to the machine gun posts and would have to be fought off from there. This is the section of the Bormans. 3 different chambers, all ventilated with bunk beds, probably for the children. What is interesting is that one consciously used a relatively warm paint color here in order to make the surroundings a little jollier.
Hier bewusst eine relativ warme Farbe verwendet worden ist, dieses Dasein unter Tage nicht ganz so öde zu gestalten.
The light switches for the children were also positioned about 50 centimeters lower than elsewhere.
Ist man 50 Zentimeter fast tiefer gegangen wie sonst wo. Es gab
The
Holzböden.
floors were wooden. You can imagine the bunk beds standing here.
Und wie man sieht,
As you can see, they even had pictures hanging on the walls. The nails are still there.
die Familie Borman war
The Bormans stayed here in this shelter for weeks, not only here underground, but in the house too, of course. The danger from enemy bombers was quite extreme at the end of 1943, so the Bormans had made themselves a home here.
43 extrem und die Familie Borman hat sich also richtig eingerichtet hier unten.
Borman's safe was removed by the Americans at the end of the war. The outline is still recognizable. A communications control room equipped with state-of-the-art devices received the latest radio messages and announcements from the front. But Borman also had a small underground town laid out for Hitler and Eva Braun. The entire entourage of the dictator would have been able to get out of danger from the Allied bomb attacks under the Berghof. At the beginning of April 1945, supplies were unloaded and stored in the shelters. Even Allied intelligence assumed that the dictator was already at Obersalzberg.
The false security of Berchtesgaden, from where so much of the world's tragedy was planned and directed, was shattered in April by a force of Allied heavy bombers. Arriving at daybreak, they attacked Hitler's notorious mountain hideout and the chalet in the valley below with 12,000-pound bombs fused for deep penetration. The SS barracks nearby also received accurate attention.
The bombs destroyed most of the buildings. The Berghof became uninhabitable. The sorry remains of Hitler's royal retinue survived in the bunkers. Then came the Americans. US Commander General Omar Bradley went to visit Obersalzberg. The demolished Berghof became a sightseeing attraction for the victors. The mysterious bunkers also aroused the interest of the US soldiers. The camera crew of the US Army captured a GI entering the Führer's bunker with curiosity. In the 1,800 square meters of shelters, Hitler and his last followers could have held out for weeks.
Up until the last day, the people at Obersalzberg expected that Hitler would come. Everything was prepared, the shelters were all furnished and ready as far as possible, and the vanguard from the Chancellery of the Reich in Berlin was already there. Therefore, one can say that if Hitler had come here, the war might have lasted a bit longer. From here, he would have been able, at least logistically, to control and direct whatever was left of his Reich at that time.
Den Trümmerhaufen, der noch übrig war zu dem Zeitpunkt, weiter zu lenken und leiten.
When the radio reported Hitler's death on May 1st, 1945, the security staff at Obersalzberg began to loot the remaining possessions of their Führer. With the permission of the Americans, Berchtesgaden citizens later also helped themselves to the hoarded supplies. Hitler's private archives had been set on fire by one of his adjutants before the Americans found them. The library that was still in the bunker, as well as his music collection and paintings, were confiscated by the Americans. It appears that unauthorized people gained access to Eva Braun's bedroom after the end of the war and staged wild parties. The cavern had been completed and was ready for occupancy by April 1945. Her large wardrobe and her china were already in there. Upon the express wishes of the Führer's lover, a bathroom with a tub had been installed especially for her. Today, there's not much left to see. The chambers stand empty, and yet illicit treasure hunters often break in and search through the puzzling maze of bunkers. The Führer's cavern was right next to Eva Braun's. Apparently, the furnishings were Spartan. The Americans cleared away all the furniture and fittings, and the rest fell into the hands of tourists and souvenir hunters. Even the tiles were stripped from the bathroom. Hitler himself had been down here only once. He decided to meet his downfall in Berlin.